everyone, and welcome to the Oyster Stew podcast. I'm Libby Hall, and today we're starting the first of a two-part series on Reg BI and fiduciary duty, two standards that continue to shape the way firms serve their clients. With the SEC sharpening its expectations under both Reg BI and fiduciary duty, firms face growing pressure to adapt their compliance programs. In this first episode, Ed Wegner is joined by Oyster consultants Brent Nix and Len Darris to break down the evolving regulatory landscape, highlight the key differences and overlaps between Reg BI and fiduciary duty, and explore what examiners are looking for today. Let's get started. Ed?
Well, thank you very much, and hello, everyone. I'm Ed Wegner, and I am the head of the Governance, Risk, and Compliance practice here at Oyster Consulting. There's been a lot of discussion lately in compliance circles about how the regulatory landscape will be transforming under this new administration. And now that the new SEC chair has been confirmed, it's likely we're going to be seeing some pretty significant changes in the approach that the SEC is taking from the prior 4 years. The question really is, where are you going to see those changes? One area where I don't anticipate seeing a huge amount of change is with regards to the standard of care for retail clients. These stem from either the fiduciary standards under the Investment Advisors Act or Reg BI for broker-dealers. And while the general requirements are pretty well understood, what we're finding is that the expectation regarding the application of those requirements has been evolving. And that's been based on what firms have been seeing through examinations that have been conducted, enforcement actions that have been issued, and then also guidance that the SEC has been providing. This includes expectations around things such as reasonably available alternatives, account type recommendations, documentation, and management of conflict. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. And I'm very fortunate to have with me Brent Nix and Len Darris, and they're going to help talk about these important topics. Brent brings a tremendous amount of experience as a CCO and as a consultant with a primary focus on the investment advisory side. And Len brings both industry and regulatory experience on the broker-dealer side. Len worked with me at FINRA, where he helped manage FINRA's national exam program. So we're very lucky to have both with us today. So to start, maybe it'd be good to get a quick refresher regarding the requirements related to the standards of care, both under the BD and the IA standards, including both how they're the same and how they differ depending on whether you're a broker-dealer or an investment advisor. So I wonder if one of you can just provide us a high-level overview of what those standards are.
Sure, Ed. This is Brent. The investment advisor world is a very nebulous yet defined standard of fiduciary duty. And what exactly does that mean? But it's always defined as you must always act in the client's best interest. And you know, what does that mean exactly in the business of providing advice, dispensing actions for a client? It's a duty of care and also a duty of loyalty. And with care, it's providing your advice based on reasonable understanding of who your client is, what their objectives are, and then combining that with loyalty, meaning you're going to take your understanding of the client and you're not going to put yourself in front of them. You're going to work as best you can to avoid the conflicts of interest and make sure that where you can't, you've discussed that with those clients. And for RIAs in particular, it's important to note that duty never goes away. It is a duty of ongoing monitoring and reevaluation of your relationship with the client during the entirety of your relationship for RIAs. Len, how does that work with broker-dealers?
Thanks, Brian. It's very similar with broker-dealers, actually. So what's interesting is the way Regulation BI was written. It really brings together advisor perspective on how you take care of a customer brings it to the brokerage industry in a sense. And the way Reg BI was written, it's several years old now. Most are aware of this, but the basics are there's 4 primary obligations of a broker-dealer. disclosure. So there's some forms you have to file. There's also information that you need to provide to the customers or even potential customers, right? So your obligation doesn't start after they're a customer. It starts even while you're trying to determine if they're going to be a customer, if you have a product or service that you can offer them, and that they're willing to take on. Then there's a care obligation. How well do you know your customer versus what products or what securities are you recommending to them? Conflicts of interest. Brent, you mentioned that. There's conflicts. A lot of that's around perhaps proprietary products, perhaps an affiliate product, perhaps just on compensation, right? Depending on how your firm's structured, what kind of securities you're offering, what kind of services you're offering. And then finally, the compliance side of things. So that compliance obligation really has to do with, have you put together a good program to make sure they're following the other requirements? Are you disclosing? Are you taking care of your customers? And then have you eliminated or mitigated and otherwise disclosed those conflicts that are out there? And then how do you know that's happening? So the controls around those compliance functions that are in your written supervisory procedures is also a very important aspect of the program.
So it sounds like under both standards, when you're talking about the obligation of care, the duty of care, you have to make a recommendation that's in the client's best interest. You don't put the interests of the advisor or the IAR or registered rep ahead of the clients. There's the product perspective in terms of reasonable basis, customer perspective or the customer specific. And then also they talk about under Reg BI this concept of quantitative best interest, which is looking at things like how frequently are you trading? Targeting things such as churning or let's say variable annuity exchanges, mutual fund switching, and these all seem like issues that from Reg BI's perspective for broker dealers as they move from suitability to this new best interest standard. I'm wondering, have the concerns of the regulators changed, or is this just providing the regulator with new tools for addressing those concerns? So I wonder, maybe, Len, if you could speak to that a little bit on the broker-dealer side.
Sure. I think the base concern of the regulators has not changed, right? So how is the firm interacting with the client? What information are they giving them? What kind of products or securities are being sold or recommended to them? And does that all make sense? So that's the base concern with the regulator, whether it's under suitability or whether it was under this new rule, regulation BI. What's interesting, though, is the added requirements, the added obligations, right? I think there's more specificity on how that full interaction works with the client as opposed to suitability. I talked to the client, we talked about a product, we sold them as suitable at the time, right? That's kind of an older view. Here we've provided information. I gathered all this information. I understand. I've reviewed my products, the securities I'm selling. I really understand them. That was required before, but now there's a little bit more around that where if you read the bulletins from the SEC, they talk a little bit more about how are you documenting these things, right? So they said you're going to disclose, you're going to take care of the customer and give them something that's reasonable for them. You're going to take care of your conflicts of interest, but how are you documenting all of these things as opposed to looking at just that point in time, which is kind of that suitability approach. Now is kind of that full lifetime of the relationship with the customer, starting from that first phone call that you may get in or may make out to them when you start approaching them about your services and products. So to me, the baseline is the same. They want to make sure the customer is being taken care of appropriately, being offered securities or products that make sense for them, but also kind of expand out the requirements a little bit across the whole lifetime of the relationship that you have with them.
And I think
Brent, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I was going to simply say that Reg BI kind of went the long way to get to the same spot that fiduciary duty, because everything that you said, it's like you have to understand from a reasonable basis standpoint, who your client base is, what are your products, and it's got to start with not only the client-specific documentation of the effort, but it really needs to start at the firm level in regards to what you're offering or what you're doing. is that reasonable for at least some of your retail clients? That's the low water mark. Are you offering it through your practice or through your shop because it's something that could be a reasonable recommended service to some clients? And then you have to dig in even farther to, okay, it is reasonable for us to offer it through our business, but now why is it reasonable for this client? And so you have two levels of documentation here to really wrap your hands around, which is, what is the firm doing to establish what's made available, what services are being provided, versus why does this particular client need those services? And to really complicate that in our modern world, most of these organizations, we've talked about RIAs, we're talking about BDs, but almost more often than not, I'll say, these are affiliates of one another. And in many instances, an individual representative for these affiliated entities could offer either service. So in what capacity am I working under, and what is actually, when I'm documenting, what is the best option for the client? Because remember, depending on the route you go, is ongoing monitoring required, not required? Is it point in time, or is it over the life of the relationship? And while these rules are bringing that together, there still are some nuances and distinctions with the account types that you're opening up with your client. All of that needs to be documented. So.
And yeah, Brian, you mentioned monitoring, right? So that's more of a kind of an IA function, an investment advisor function. They will monitor accounts or looking, do we need to make changes? But even on the broker dealer side, where you have an ongoing relationship with a client, while it's not monitoring, if you're going to be recommending another security, another product to them, you still have to know what's in the account, what's in their other accounts, what other assets do they have, right? So you're not quite monitoring, you're looking at things as the recommendations are coming up or as you're going to be making them. So not really monitoring actively. However, you have to understand the history of that account, of that individual, of the assets that individual has to be able to, really make a good, solid recommendation, and then be able to document that. I think we'll talk about documentation a little bit more later and some of the important aspects there. But so while it's not monitoring, it's very close, right? So the Reg BI brings us into that, closer to that fiduciary standard on the broker dealer side.
Yeah, and I think you guys brought up two really important points. Lenny just hit on one that we're going to discuss in more detail later, and that one is documentation. What needs to be documented? How do you document? And the other is with respect to account type recommendations, right? So when you're talking about, if you're both a broker dealer and an investment advisor, you're going to have to decide, well, what type of account's best for them? And so you're going to have to go across those standards when you're considering that. So really important things to consider. And then with respect to whether these are new standards, I think this has really been borne out in the enforcement actions that we've seen. The enforcement actions, the activity that's being addressed isn't different than the activity that you saw being addressed under the suitability model, but they're just doing it with these new tools for under the best interest standard. And in one area, especially this quantitative suitability, one of the challenges that FINRA had in bringing those types of cases under the suitability model was you had to demonstrate that the registered rep or that the firm had de facto control over the customer's account, whereas now with Reg Best Interest, they took that element away. And so you can show that series of recommendations wasn't in the client's best interest without having to show that you've demonstrated that there was de facto control. So this is providing new tools for regulators to go after concerns that they've had, for quite some time. One of the specific requirements that was outlined with Reg BI, but also in the SEC staff bulletins for investment that spoke to investment advisor requirements as well, is the requirement to, as part of making a recommendation, to assess reasonably available alternatives. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you, both from the IA perspective and the BD perspective, is what are the types of things that need to be assessed? What are the considerations that firms should be looking at when comparing alternatives?
Well, on the brokerage side, there's quite a few things, right? So there are products or securities that, may be seen as competitors with each other or similar enough to each other that, for a given client, maybe you want to offer both. So what comes to mind, maybe an annuity in mutual funds, different structures, different products, definitely different types of assets. However, they both provide access to different types of sub-account or funds, mutual funds that are out there. They both have ability to move between investments, right? So in the annuity, you can move between your sub-accounts. In the fund family, you can move between fund types, right? So to talk about what's a reasonably available alternative, that would make sense. If you offer proprietary products as well as other products of other issuers, right? What are those reasonably available alternatives that your firm offers? Not the whole industry, right? The industry is huge. There's many issuers of ETFs, mutual funds, annuities, et cetera. So if you have a proprietary product or a proprietary line of mutual funds, certainly part of what would be reasonably available would be other funds that are out there offered by other fund issuers. Now, there are certain firms that have very limited offerings, and we could talk about that a little bit more. Brent, I'd like your view on some of this too.
Right.
So, the limited offerings is kind of another way to think about reasonable alternatives that are out there. But generally, it means you're looking at what's available, what makes sense for the client, what's available to them, making the offer, and then discussing what's going to ultimately be in their best interest on the broker-dealer side.
Right. That's a lot of that, honestly, should go under the caption of common sense, right? You need to try to match what you're doing for what the client's attempting to achieve. And for those that are working in the advisory space, very often your available options are dictated by the custodians that you're using. So those available options can be massive. So mutual funds, ETFs, individual equities, you have to understand and have well documented the anticipated trading activity for the strategy that you're looking to employ. What is the client's current income needs for what they need? All of the things that you would normally or that you do document to capture point in time suitability under the old verbiage is what you're constantly reassessing with what you're doing. So when you're coming up with these alternatives, you have to constantly think about cost, overall risk, the performance features. And this is, and I said it earlier, really documenting to these regulatory requirements is a client specific level, but it starts at the firm level. A lot of these things where we come up with the reasonably available alternatives has to do with the firm's evaluation with what products are made available. Is it 3 separate, to your broker dealer example, Len, 3 different variable annuities, or do we have 12? And then how do we assist in helping the reps make the proper evaluations to what best matches the clients? Or are those contracts the best possible matches, and do they need that added layer of expense? I don't want to make it sound like it's simplistic, but it is. And as a practitioner, as a CCO, I can tell you from a documentation standpoint, very often individuals would rely on what I would call the canned wholesaler speak. And that's what they end up giving you as the explanation for why this makes sense. Well, it's why this product may make sense, but it has no bearing on whether it makes sense for this particular client. The advice I always provided was, I understand how the product works. Now you need to explain to me why Jane client needs that product. That's the part that you need to fill in. And the factors that you determine are going to be the way that you answer that response. And it's complicated but simple all at the same time. Just fill in the gap. Why did this particular client need that? So,
well, one of the things that you mentioned, Brent, that I think is really important for people to understand is that this starts well before you're making a recommendation to a client, and it really starts at when you're deciding what products to put on your shelf, and making sure that those products that are on there are ones that are cost-effective, ones that have performance characteristics that are appropriate for your client. And then one of the challenges I've seen firms have is as they recruit new representatives in, they oftentimes bring in a lot of the products that those reps were selling. And so the product shelf over time can expand. So it's really important for firms to be thinking about when they're looking at their product shelf, periodically going through there and saying, hey, what product should we really have on there? Because if it's on your product shelf and it's comparable, you really got to consider, should we be considering this when we're comparing alternatives? So you really want to make sure over time you're assessing your product shelf to make sure that it doesn't get unwieldy and that you really have a shelf of products that are really meant to meet your client's needs over time. Another thing that you guys mentioned that I think is really important too is when you are making the recommendation, I've heard it referred to as a funnel. You start with, well, what's the right asset class, right? Len, to your point, is it an annuity? Is it a mutual fund, individual stocks? So you first look at it at the asset class. And then once you've decided on the asset class, what products within that asset class are appropriate for that customer, and then comparing within that asset class, looking at things like cost, risk, performance, et cetera. And then the other thing with respect to limited product shelf, the SEC said it's okay to have a limited product shelf, but you can't use that as an excuse to make a recommendation that's not in a client's best interest. So it's really important to understand all of those aspects because they're going to be key, and that's what the regulators are going to be looking at when they come out to conduct an examination of your firm.
Be sure to join us for part 2, where Ed, Bren, and Len will dive deeper into documentation best practices, compensation conflicts, and rollover recommendations. Thanks for listening to the Oyster Stew podcast. If you'd like to learn more about how Oyster can help your firm strengthen its compliance program, visit us at oysterllc.com.